Thank you. Today we're going to be speaking with Dr. Vali Nasr, who's a professor of international politics here at the Fletcher School. And I'd like to just first ask Dr. Nasr, you've had extensive experience both inside of government and also working in academia. And I was just wondering, maybe you could tell our viewers what the transition is like going from one to the other, if there are particular aspects that you miss while working, that you miss about academia while working in government and vice versa, and how you were able to manage both of these two endeavors.
Well, there's a great deal of overlap between what you do in government and what you do in academia. Ultimately, what you do in government is to put in practice or experiment with many of the ideas that you think about in academia. But the approaches are fundamentally different. Academia is much more focused on deeper questions, historically and also theoretically, whereas government is much more focused on fixing problems in the immediate. And sometimes you do miss that deep reflection of being able to be engaged in much more abstract thinking about conceptual ideas, about historical ideas. You appreciate the slower pace of thinking and reflecting and writing in academia. But on the other hand, there is also something rewarding about being engaged in things as they happen and having an impact there. Ultimately, I think the challenge has always been to maintain the right balance of being able to have that kind of deeper reflection, which is absolutely necessary for depth of knowledge, but also be able to apply it in a meaningful way to the kinds of questions policymakers and people in the government are concerned with.
Who has a very extensive academic background, and you spend a lot of time exploring all these issues. Is it ever frustrating to not be able to really, I guess, push the pedal to the floor as far as you'd like?
Well, yes, I mean in multiple ways. One is that academics have the liberty to think about what they want, to do it at the pace they want, to frame their own questions, to set their own agenda of thinking. It might take 2 years to write a great book, or 10 years to write a great book. And ultimately, the kinds of questions that it answers becomes the judge of it. You don't have that luxury in government. In government, issues move much faster and at a much rapid pace, and you have to be able to address what is that the government needs to be done in the time frame that it needs to have those things done. Secondly, the government is by nature much more bureaucratic. There is a lot more adherence to the structure and routine and the process and the procedure that frames policymaking and the work of government. Like the greatest frustration is that there is a certain confinement that is put on thinking and on discussion by the whole bureaucratic process. And then there's also a lot of necessary but unrewarding work. I mean, a single speech or declaration or statement may take days of back and forth over every comma and every sentence and every word, and that at some point you feel you're going from the 50,000 feet at which academics think literally to an inch height off the ground, and that becomes clearly is not the best part of government work.
For some of the people that have never had the sort of experience you've had inside of government, is there any particular story or anecdote that you might be able to offer about kind of what it's like to advise a high-ranking diplomat or a president, and really just what the experience is like and what's challenging about it, what's fun about it, and just something that you might be able to tell our viewers about that?
Well, it's always rewarding to think that the area of academia that you're concerned with is of great interest to those who are making policy. So that in itself is rewarding. The fact that they might find what you tell them as eye-opening or as useful to their thinking, those are all very rewarding. And you encounter policymakers that are super smart, and policymakers that it is an uphill climb to get them to put their hands around conceptual ideas. You encounter policymakers who are familiar with the Middle East and may come back at you with their own anecdotes and experiences and be able to engage you, and those who cannot find the area of the world you're working on a map if you put it in front of them. But I think the most important thing to note is that you have to be able to communicate the relevant knowledge and the relevant context that the policymakers need to know in a way that is useful to them. If you begin to tell them the whole history from Plato to NATO on a topic, you're going to lose them. If you're going to tell them, to fix this particular problem, you need to change the world, you're going to lose them. They may agree with you, but you cannot go to a policymaker and say, the solution to a conflict in a particular area is to change the entire economic development and level of prosperity on that continent, which might be very, very true, but it's not very useful to them. They need to know much more clearly what is the immediate reason for the problem they're confronting, and what are the 2-3 things that they need to know or they need to do in order to have an impact on it. There is always at the end of every conversation a "so what" clause there. So what does this mean for me? So what does this mean for our policy? And if you're not able to relate that to them, it doesn't matter how much knowledge you bring to the table, the knowledge is not really usable to them.